5 minutes early or something like that, which was great. On the way back, our flight took off 4 minutes after scheduled departure time from O'Hare, which is like unheard of. When does that happen? That never happens.
Saturday night.
Saturday night.
It's the only time.
It was great. I flew Delta on a pair of A220-100s, got upgraded to first class even due to my relatively still pretty low status with the airline. But again, flying on a Saturday, it's great. There were like 80 empty seats on each flight. Everything was great. On the way back, we took a really northerly approach between Chicago and New York. We actually flew over Toronto, which is a little odd for that route, but we had an approach to runway 4 at LaGuardia, and it was the best approach I've ever had into LaGuardia view-wise, since we cut right over Midtown Manhattan, went down the Hudson River, and made a U-turn around the Battery of Lower Manhattan, and it was just an absolutely spectacular view at night, and I wish every flight were that easy and scenic.
That would be ideal. But alas, what would we have to talk about if every flight was that easy?
Yeah, that story is real short. I mean, it was nice going to O'Hare, seeing some airplanes I don't typically get to see. You've got some interesting airlines out there.
Yeah, like SkyWest.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't really what I meant. But
yeah. I'm sorry.
I mean, there are a lot of E145s there. That's interesting. We don't get to see those here in New York, I think, at all. Not even in Newark anymore. If there are very few of them. But overall, very fun day. Got to go to Delta's new terminals in both LaGuardia and O'Hare. So cross 2 off my list there.
So a win all around.
A win all around. And I got some hot dogs and Italian beef sandwiches, and everything was great.
There you go. Outside of that day trip, it was a very busy weekend for all the wrong reasons, unfortunately. So that was a nice diversion before diving right back into all sorts of things that have been happening over the week that we're going to talk about now.
Yeah, some of these, they're big ones.
Yeah. So first up, let's just get the unidentified floating object story out of the way. We're up to, I think, 4 shootdowns now in total between the Chinese balloon that was shot down off the East Coast last week now, and then the 3 more that were not necessarily balloons, but things, possibly balloons, likely balloons, but not necessarily spy balloons, probably not spy balloons. We don't know. We're still trying to find them after we shot them down. Anyway, the other ones were shot down because they were flying at altitudes where commercial flights could, in fact, impact them. The Chinese balloon was shot down because they wanted to shoot down the Chinese spy balloon. These were downed because they were flying at altitudes, I think, ranging between 20 and 40,000 feet, where a commercial aircraft could ostensibly impact it, and that would be bad. So they downed them. There's an errant Sidewinder missile somewhere in or around Lake Huron.
So if anybody finds it's still one, going today and never came down.
Some say. So if you find that, don't touch it. Call local authorities. But hopefully this is all, done, but we'll see. The explanation that we've got from NORAD about why all of a sudden we're seeing a bunch more floating objects is both helpful in its simplicity, but also kind of makes you go, huh? Because they said that these things aren't necessarily new. It's just that they turned up the juice on the radars so that they could see more stuff. And so now they're seeing more stuff. So was there always stuff there before that they weren't seeing? And I don't know if that's supposed to make me feel better because they weren't wasting their time, because it seems like these weren't necessarily or weren't at all threats to anybody other than perhaps floating through commercial airspace. But does that make me feel better? I don't know.
I feel like this has probably been going on for a long, long time, and now it made the public view, and they can't be ignored at this point until the public forgets about it in the next news cycle, and then life continues. I can't imagine that the military is going to keep shooting these down anytime there's something unexplained in the air, because these could vary from legitimate weather balloons to ridiculous gender reveal things floating in the sky that probably shouldn't be there. I think we've probably heard the last of this for a while, but that opinion might turn out to be completely wrong.
One can only hope. I just keep thinking of the scene from Blazing Saddles when he goes, "Gentlemen, we must protect our phony baloney jobs," with all of these balloon things, like just one after another.
I don't know. Those missiles are expensive. What did I read? They were like $400,000 a piece. So if you find the one that missed the target, which happens, again, these are very small targets. If you happen to find it, don't try to sell it because they probably won't buy it back.
One Sidewinder on eBay. Great. Okay. Let's not talk about that for the rest of time if we can manage it. Now, here's where the weekend really got busy, unfortunately. So I got a message from our good friend John Ostrower, who was just on the program, and he said, "Do you have some data on a particular flight?" And he included language that led me to believe that I was not going to like what I saw when I pulled the data for him. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
How quickly did you go from pulling up the data to going, oh no.
So I found the flight, and as soon as I opened the speed altitude graph, it was abundantly clear that something went very wrong. So we're talking about United Airlines flight 1722 that departed from Maui last December. So this was the 18th of December. And the flight was flying from Maui to San Francisco. And about a minute and 11 seconds after takeoff, the aircraft went from leveling off after departure to a steep dive and dove down for a short period of time, but it dove pretty far to about 800 feet above the sea. So the lowest recorded point in the ADS-B data that we have is 775 feet. So the aircraft recovered and they continued their climb and flew on to San Francisco, landed without incident. They filed the appropriate internal something bad happened reports. The airline began an investigation that is currently ongoing. The FAA began an investigation. The airline stated that the pilots involved have received additional training. And then 2 days after the publication of John's article, which went up on Sunday, so yesterday, Tuesday, the 14th of February, the NTSB announced that it is in fact investigating this incident. United had previously said that the NTSB notification was unnecessary because no one was hurt and the aircraft was not damaged. But the NTSB says, no, we're going to take a look at it. And so they're currently investigating. John's done some additional reporting, and his reporting now points to how the pilots retracted the flaps and their communication while that was occurring. I'll read from John's latest report. The inquiries into the incident currently center on how and when the 777's flaps were retracted and the interaction of the two crew members during the climb out leading to the upset. And that's according to people briefed on the matter. And John's reporting in the Air Current, which we'll link to because their aviation safety reporting is available without a paywall.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is another incident where the recorders on board the aircraft, both the data recorder and the voice recorder, will be of no help because they only record, 2 hours of data, and the flight itself was probably triple that duration. So it's gone. There's not going to be much here for the NTSB to rely on, especially since crew communication was almost certainly going to be the most important part of what they need to look into here. So not great. Really, really, really need to up those recorder standards, but it's not even certain in this case that even though that the crew did file the proper procedures with United internally and that the FAA was notified, it's not clear that the recorders were pulled or would have been pulled because they did not notify the NTSB. Regardless, even if they wanted to, that data's gone long before they landed. And it's yet another case that solidifies the push to increase the recorder time on board these aircraft. It's just the 2-hour limitation repeatedly coming up recently as being woefully inadequate.
To be clear, the 2-hour recording limitation is the loop on the cockpit voice recorder. So the entirety of the flight would have been available on the flight data recorder. So the
Yes,
control
good
column
correction.
inputs
Thank you.
and things like that. So that would have been available. But as Jason mentioned, it's unclear whether or not the flight data recorder was pulled when the flight arrived in San Francisco, if they pulled the quick access recorder, if they pulled the full flight data recorder, or if they just did nothing and filed the report. But as Jason mentioned, regardless of whether or not they would have pulled or could have pulled any of those things, the cockpit voice recorder, gone. The NTSB has been calling for increased cockpit voice recording lengths for a long period of time. We talked about this. I mean, we mentioned it when we talked about the Qatar incident a few weeks ago, when we talked about it with Sean Payne, the investigator in the NTSB's recorder lab, about how the NTSB has consistently lost out on valuable information because they don't have access to what was being said or the sounds that the aircraft is making on the flight deck during an incident or before and after an incident. So I think at this point, it's long past time. It's not like the technology is unavailable here.
This is purely a restriction that it is fabricated. It doesn't need to exist. This is a code change on the existing hardware to increase the looped recording time from 2 hours to what is the proposed time? 28 hours or something like that?
I believe it's 25. Yeah.
25 hours, something much, much more adequate that should cover. Ideally, it would be able to cover any outbound and return flight of, let's say, the longest flights in the world. And I guess 25 is probably going to cover 95% of those. But this has got to change. We are well beyond any technical limitation for virtually any aircraft operating the world. I'm sure this is nothing more than a single line of code in these recorders that needs to be changed. You change a 2. You don't even have to delete the 2. You can just add a 5 next to the 2, and it's fine. I don't actually know what.
I'm not sure if that's quite how it works.
But whatever it is, whether they need upgraded firmware on the existing hardware, or I doubt they would need actual new hardware, or if they need to just put in another memory module in existing hardware. Either way, there is no rational, reasonable argument against increasing the recording time at this point. Anyone who argues against increasing over 2 hours, it is disingenuous and they have another agenda, or they're just outright lying. It has got to change at this point.
I would love to hear the argument against it. If you've got one, email us at podcast@fr24.com and we'll talk about it on the show.
Anyone with this stance is going to be reaching out.
I'm just saying, if you're against it, please let us know why, and we'll talk about it on the show. So on a different Hawaiian island, about a month later, a much less dire incident occurred. The NTSB announced that they're investigating a runway incursion involving a United 777 and Kamaka Air Cessna 208.
Did it happen to be the same United 777? Not to put you on the spot, but
no, it's a different. Okay. It's
so we can't just identify a troublemaker.
No, it's not. It's a different aircraft. The 777 involved in the runway incursion is actually line number 2. The second, one of the very old 777s, the second 777 ever built. So what happened was United flight from Denver landed runway 4 right in Honolulu. The Kamaka Air flight was landing runway 4 left. The United flight crossed runway 4 left as the Cessna was completing its landing roll. Looking at the data, it's one of those, yes, this was a runway incursion, but no, there was never really a danger of the two aircraft ever coming into contact. This was certainly a case of figuring out what went wrong, and as with all NTSB safety investigations, making sure it doesn't happen again, and certainly something that we don't want to see. But the Cessna was well into its deceleration process to make its turnoff onto a much earlier taxiway, and the 777 was moving across the runway. So should it have happened? Absolutely not. Was this along the lines of JFK, which we'll talk about in a few minutes? Not necessarily, no. Actually, let's talk about the JFK thing now, and then we'll work our way up to what the FAA announced today.
All right. Where do we even begin with this? This is it's been an interesting week on this topic.
Yeah. So I think over the weekend when we were trying to enjoy
it was a Friday news dump, actually.
Oh, okay. Okay. So what happened was we found out that the pilots of the American Airlines flight that crossed JFK's runway 4 left. I'm sticking with 4 left now, but moving to JFK, they were refusing to speak with the NTSB investigators.
Yeah, so the NTSB put out its, I believe its preliminary report on the matter, which is
Yes.
quite quick, which is great. And some other information was revealed as well. I think the two aircraft came within, what was it, 1,400 feet of each other? Did I get that?
1,400 feet, yes.
1,400 feet, which is not much. 1,400 feet separation on runway 4 left, but then it was quite concerning to read that the NTSB noted that the American pilots refused to talk to the NTSB on, not just on the record, but have a recording or a stenographer take a transcript of the interview with the pilots. And the NTSB just basically flat out said, and then actually followed up with a press release after the release of the preliminary report, that the American pilots refused to talk. The NTSB offered multiple methods of recording the meeting rather than just, I guess, handwritten notes. The NTSB wanted to either do audio recording or have a stenographer take a transcript of the meeting, which apparently is not uncommon, the latter of the two. And the Union of the American Pilots just refused to participate in that for reasons I don't agree with, but I think you, Ian, have a different opinion on the matter. Because we already had this conversation.
Yeah, we've already had this conversation, but we can have it again because now we're recording it. My feeling was that these are safety investigations. These are not
prosecution.
They're
Events,
not adversarial events. It's not the movie Sully where the NTSB is portrayed to be a prosecutor.
I was going to say the same thing.
That's not it. Anyone who saw that movie who is, familiar with how an NTSB investigation works,
go read Robert Sumwalt's piece about it, who published a piece about that a couple months ago, who basically outright said that movie right there, that's all bullshit. That didn't happen.
Oh, we're going to have to bleep that.
That'll have to happen.
But Jason's right. And Robert Sumwalt, who is the former chair of the NTSB, by the way.
Thank you.
That's what he did in fact say. And so my argument here is that, like, if we're going to record the interviews, because what the NTSB wanted to do was audio record it for a verbatim transcription. And the pilots union said they would not participate in audio recorded interviews in any manner. And I get where they're coming from, because if there's an audio recording, there's the possibility that that recording could be used in any manner in an adversarial, kind of context, or there's a chance that that recording could be leaked.
Yes, there's a chance, but does that ever happen?
Let me defend the NTSB on the back half of that sentence.
Okay.
The NTSB, and when we talked with Sean Payne about this, we talked about, what happens to the CVR recordings. And he's like, well, they get locked down. They never get out. We don't let them out. I
don't recall of any case, forget the NTSB or any national investigator. I don't know of any instance where the voice recorder has leaked.
There are a few out there, and you can find them if you look for them. But as far as the NTSB is concerned, they have a stellar track record of making sure that those audio recordings don't get out. And so I don't see a problem with this, with the assurances that this is for the investigation, that the accurate statements of the pilots are recorded accurately and verbatim. I don't see a problem with that. But the NTSB said, well, okay, fine, we'll subpoena you. And they did. And now the pilots will be talking to investigators.
Yes, but apparently not of their own volition. They're merely complying with the subpoena at this point. And it's important to remember that court stenographer, they are not somehow miraculously writing down every single word anyone's utters in a courtroom, or in this case, a conference room or whatever. It is very much shorthand, and they have to fill in a lot of the gaps. So if I were discussing something with the NTSB, I would prefer a recording. I would want everything I say to be transcribed verbatim, rather than, I guess in this case, a version of a court reporter or a stenographer where it's more shorthand. If you read what a court stenographer has taken down in their machine, you're not going to understand what they're saying. There's a lot of interpretation needed in that. So I understand why they may not want a recorded interview. Maybe that's not typical or common, but it's a really bad look for the pilots and the pilots union in my eyes to outright refuse to speak to the NTSB merely because it's being recorded. It looks poorly on the union, the airline, the pilots. It doesn't look good for anyone in this industry, especially with the very predictable headlines that went out of American Airlines pilots refuse to talk to investigators. Doesn't look good for anyone. I understand that the pilots are probably just doing what their union representation was telling them to do, but I just don't agree with it.
I don't really have anything to add on
No,
that one.
I'm sure we'll get hate mail for that opinion, but that is my opinion.
If you've got an opinion, our email box is podcast@fr24.com and always is open. And we do read everything, and I make Jason transcribe every email we get verbatim. So we said all of that to work up to what happened today. And that is the FAA's acting administrator, Billy Nolen, has announced a safety summit and kind of a top-down review of the United States aviation safety scheme, how the FAA keeps air travel safe in the United States. He starts off by saying, we are experiencing the safest period in aviation history. And by the measure of accidents, serious incidents, and fatalities, that's true. He then says, but we cannot take this for granted. I agree. Recent events remind us that we must not become complacent. Also agree. And now is this is an interesting phrase. Now is the time, and I'm quoting again, now is the time to stare into the data and ask hard questions. I'm not sure what that means, but I like it.
The subtext of that paragraph is, hey, everyone, what the hell is going on? We need to probably meet and figure out why we keep having all these near misses or runway incursions or planes almost landing on top of each other. Now's the time to stop that from becoming an actual catastrophe. They're going to hold this safety summit in March to examine, I'm quoting here, what actions the aviation community needs to take to maintain our safety record. But at the very end of this, I find it interesting that the memo here closes out by saying, and I quote, "We know that our aviation system is changing dramatically. Now is the time to act." I would love for him to expand on what he means by changing dramatically. What is changing dramatically? And I know there's a lot going on post-COVID, a lot of progression in the pilot intake process from first officers being promoted to captain rather quickly because there just isn't a lot of first officer to pull from these days. But I would love for him to open in March on the first day of the summit to explain exactly what is changing dramatically.
Well, I mean, I think a few things. One, you have to deal with the dramatic increase in rocketry. And he mentions that, as far as dealing with the National Airspace System and rocket launches. But also, I think that the technology of flight is changing, rather quickly in terms of aviation development. eVTOLs, electric flight, hydrogen power, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's what he means. But again, I would like to hear it from acting administrator.
And that reminds
Billy
me,
Nolen.
one more thing we forgot to mention back when we were talking about the American runway incursion at JFK, speaking of technology, the NTSB preliminary report did mention that ASDE-X, which is basically the ground aircraft monitoring system that will notify air traffic control if there is a runway incursion of some sort, that was functional, that did notify ATC that a runway incursion was, I guess, not imminent, but occurring. And that is what triggered the air traffic controller to tell Delta to abort their takeoff, basically. So, hey, that's one more piece of technology that is changing dramatically for the better in that case.
We'll take it. Okay, so that's a lot going on in the U.S. Let's leave the U.S. and head to Nepal, because today the preliminary report on the crash of the Yeti Airlines ATR that crashed last month, that report came out this week. It was released on Monday. So over the past few weeks, we've seen a bit trickle out about the power management by the pilots and the fact that the propellers were put into a feather. Now we have a bit more information about what had happened. I do want to back up and talk about who was flying the aircraft. This is from the preliminary report, and I'm quoting now. The accident occurred during a visual approach for runway 12 at VNPR, which is the ICAO code for Pokhara Airport. This was the third flight by the crew members on that day. The flight was operated by two captains. One captain was in the process of obtaining aerodrome familiarization for operating into Pokhara, and the other captain was the instructor pilot. The captain being familiarized, who was occupying the left-hand seat, was the pilot flying, and the instructor pilot, occupying the right-hand seat, was the pilot monitoring.
Okay, nothing out of the ordinary there. Continue.
So then we move to kind of the final phase of flight. And this is section 1.14 of the preliminary report. The pilot flying disengaged the autopilot system at an altitude of 721 feet above ground level. The pilot flying then called for flaps 30 at 10:56:32, and the pilot monitoring replied, flaps 30 and descending. As Jason's vocalizations portend, that's not what happened. Quote, the flight data recorder did not record any flap surface movement at that time. Instead, the propeller rotation speed of both engines decreased simultaneously to less than 25%, and the torque started decreasing to 0, which is consistent with both propellers going into the feathered condition. On the cockpit voice recorder, area microphone recording, a single master caution chime was recorded at 10:56:36. The flight crew then carried out the before landing checklist before starting the left turn onto the base leg. During that time, the power lever angle increased from 41% to 44%. At the point, the propeller rotation speed and the torque of both engines were 0. And the propellers are in feather. They are not producing thrust.
Yeah, not great. So basically what happened here, what we believe, or what the investigators believe happened, is that the pilot monitoring accidentally feathered the props rather than moving the flaps from 15 to 30, and confirmed that they were moving to 30 while that was actually not ever going to be the case. He had actually